Okay, we're going to get started with our next panel. I know it's really challenging to shift from property taxes because that is our most favorite tax conversation to be having in the state of Nebraska. But I'm really excited for this next panel discussion, which is going to talk about another important revenue source for the state of Nebraska, and particularly for our local governments, and that is fines and fees. This morning, we have yet another fantastic panel who's going to talk about the efficiency of fines and fees as a revenue source for local governments. Talk about how the impacts of fines and fees are felt disproportionately across different types of Nebraskans, which is something that we see not just in Nebraska, but we see this in a number of different states across the country. But it's time for us to be having this conversation in Nebraska as well. And then we're going to talk about some tax policy options that can potentially put pressure on fines and fees to fund local public services. We've got a really distinguished panel here with profound experience here in Nebraska, particularly Jasmine Harris, who's the architect of criminal justice reform recently. And also, I have to say that Jasmine and I have spent a good amount of time in the Rotunda together and have discovered that tax policy and criminal justice are often intricately related in the legislative decision-making process because of how bills work through the legislature. We also have some profound experience with Desmond Brian White from Kansas, as well as Ashley Spivey from Ivy Black Girl, who's a real leader here in Nebraska, and moderator George Dungan from LD26, who's going to kick us off. So over to you, Senator Dungan.
All right. Is this on? Can you hear me okay? I talk loud, but if you can't hear me, just raise your hand, okay? I also talk fast, so if I'm talking too quickly, if somebody could tell me to slow down, that would be much appreciated. Good morning. Thank you for having us all here. I'm just going to kick this off with a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to get to our panelists, who are the ones that I think we actually want to hear from. As she said, my name is George Dungan. I'm a state senator from Legislative District 26. That's Northeast Lincoln, for those of you who don't know. I do serve on the Banking and Insurance Committee, and also, probably most relevant to what we're doing here today, the Revenue Committee. So I did have an opportunity to hear a number of the issues that I'm sure you've already talked about this morning on the committee last year, and I'm continuing to be a part of those conversations moving forward. Probably more relevant to the panel discussion that we're having here today is, in my prior life, before I became a legislator, I was a public defender here in Lancaster County. I served as a public defender in Lancaster County for almost 10 years. I worked in juvenile units, misdemeanor units, felony units across the entire spectrum. So I had an opportunity in that job to really get to know both A, how our justice system works and doesn't work from time to time, but B, I got the opportunity to see the impact that fines and fees can have on folks that are my clientele. So as a public defender, the people that you work with are folks that have been adjudged legally indigent by the court. What that means is they're folks who can't afford their own attorney, and therefore have an attorney appointed to them for various kinds of cases. Throughout my time working as a public defender, working in those populations, I had an opportunity to work with folks who ultimately worked their way through the system and were ordered to pay a number of fines and fees. And without getting too much into the details, I saw the vast impact that can have on people when they're struggling to make ends meet, specifically lower income populations. And I think specifically and most relevant to our panel here today, justice-involved folks and BIPOC individuals as well. So I did have an opportunity to work in that system, but I am by no means the expert. I think we have the real experts on the panel here today. And so what we're going to be discussing is sort of the impact that fines and fees has on our system as a whole. I think we're also going to be discussing a little bit the interplay between revenue and our tax policy and fines and fees. You know, what we know is that our policies with regards to revenue impact the financial health and the financial welfare of cities and counties. And our current system is working in such a way that fines and fees as imposed by the court are a source or a stream of revenue that is often counted upon by various organizations and entities within the court system. So I think we're going to have a really robust conversation about whether that's good, bad, the problems that we can encounter, and then hopefully some solutions moving forward that we can talk about as a state to sort of fix some of the problems we see with fines and fees. So let me start by introducing our panelists. To my left, we have Jasmine Harris. Many of you know her, I'm sure, already. Jasmine Harris is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy with RISE. Prior to her current role, Harris served as co-founder and CEO of Waymaker LLC, as well as Civic Engagement Committee Chair for the Urban League of Nebraska Young Professionals. Further to the left, we have Desmond White. Desmond is a program manager and lead organizer with Progeny, a Wichita-based nonprofit serving youth affected by the juvenile justice system. Desmond has also written and published a book, Better Days in 90 Days, Secrets, Tips, and Cheat Codes. And then all the way at the end of the table here, we have Ashley Spivey. Ashley is the founder and executive director of IB Black Girl, which many of us are familiar with their amazing work. Ashley's been recognized as a 2018 Midlands Business Journal 40 Under 40 recipient, as well as 2018 Greater Omaha Chamber of Commerce Young Professional Changemaker. Let's give them all a round of applause to kick it off. So I'm going to start with this question, and I'm going to pose this to everybody if we just want to go down the table. I don't know how y'all want to have the conversation, but I'm also happy to have a discussion. I think we can bounce around. It doesn't have to be super formal. First of all, really simplistic here. Please describe some of Nebraska's current forms of fines and fees, such as court fines and fees for traffic violations. And please, can you talk about their efficiency as a source of revenue for local and state governments in Nebraska?
Testing. Oh, okay. There we go. Can you all hear me? Awesome. So thank you all for being here today and staying to listen to our panel. As Senator Dungan posed the question, what are current forms of fines and fees here in Nebraska? Before I start talking, are there any judges or lawyers in the room today? Okay, so a lot of the fines and fees that we're talking about, there's differences. Fines are like the penalties that are placed on people if they're coming through the criminal justice system. And then the fees are the things that are then added on top of that take care of whatever costs may be. So here in Nebraska, I know for sure that when we have individuals who are going through like the pretrial system, so this is from arrest to being sentenced, there is this point in time where you have bail. You're supposed to be able to or not able to pay to get out of jail at this point in time. You're not considered guilty just yet. So for whatever reason, you could have been found guilty or you pled no contest. So then on top of that, you have someone trying to pay for you to get out of jail. You have then now been sentenced. You have a fine, which could be, depending on what your sentence is, as low as $500, as low as $50. It can go up to $10,000. So it just all depends on what that structure of that sentence is. Then you have a fee put on top of that. So you have your court fees. These court fees then therefore are broken down into different avenues of what they're considered to help pay for. So some of those court fees include things like judge's retirement fund. We're basically funding our county and district courts off of the fees that we put on people who are going through the criminal justice system. And when we're looking at or listening to previous panels and we're talking about property taxes and things like that, you start thinking about when these things are being cut, when income taxes are being cut, where else is that money going to come from? Here in Nebraska, right now we're faced with like an overcrowding situation in our prisons and jails. So therefore, we're continuously recycling people through these systems, putting fines upon fees upon fines upon fees upon them. And if they can't pay, then there's also then this where we are picking them back up and reincarcerating them due to the inability to pay. So we have to look at how are we funding and getting revenue through these systems when we have people who are homeless or unhoused. We have people who are struggling with substance use disorders. We have people who are struggling with mental health disorders, and we're expecting them to be able to continue paying these fines and fees. And then that also impacts with not being able to get work because they now have this criminal history, and it's this repeated cycle that keeps our families, because it's not just impacting that one person, it impacts the whole family. We also look at things when someone is incarcerated, you have fees to make phone calls. So one, you not only have to pay for that phone call, there are fees on top of that phone call. So if I'm in a county jail and I'm trying to call home, my family is going to have to then therefore pay for me to contact them. And at one point in time, and all counties haven't come into alignment, but these costs could cost about $1 a minute plus. So when you're looking at how are we continually trying to make government run, make these services run, we're putting it on the backs of people who are struggling the most.
Hello, everyone. I think the only thing that I would add, I think that was a great explanation, Jasmine. Like thinking about our title and the work that's in front of us is really, it's an equity issue and quality of life. And so when we talk about fines and fees, it's about monetizing people that are incarcerated, and that becomes a business. And so Jasmine mentioned we have overcrowding here. People of color are disproportionately represented in the prison system. We make up a smaller population in Nebraska. And so it's really about quality of life. What do we want to actualize for Nebraskans? And how do we make sure that we give the people the support they need? That we are thinking about our social systems while also trying to understand how can we make sure Nebraska can be an effective government system, right? And so it's that balance of like operations, business side, what does that look like with like the humanity of people, which I feel like in this conversation, hopefully we center and talk about that humanity side so that you can all take that back into the wonderful work that you are doing to become advocates.
When I hear everything that has been said today, as it relates to how things are done in Kansas, first off, I want to say my experience of Kansas, where I'm from, Wichita, is one of the more, it's 13% African-American population in my city. I say that to say is anything that we want to see changed, we have to go over and beyond in order to allow our voices to be heard. In Progeny, we say that our story is bigger than the box that they try to put us in. Being impacted myself, I've been through a life I've seen it from several different sides, inside the system and as you can see outside the system, but being able to, articulate and tell those stories are important. Some of the young people I work with, they've been on probation, they've been on house ankle monitors, house arrests, court fees, ticket fees, and all of these are impactful because if you aren't able to pay these fees, then that usually leads to incarceration at an early age. Being able to stop some of those fines and fees in the beginning is important because you got to think about how we are redistributing some of those fees. I know in Kansas, they spend more money trying to collect fees than they do actually getting the fees. So I'm sure we'll get into that as we balance the revenue, but that's a crazy statistic thinking we're willing to spend $500,000 to collect $300,000. Like, if we want to start to save money, I believe that, we could start there and just reassess why we're assessing these fines and fees. Is it just out of practice? Is it that hold them accountable? Is it an idea of, or can we stretch our brains and stretch our leadership in order to think of innovative ways in order to create better systems for our young people, for humanity?
I think those are all excellent points. The only thing I can add to that as a practitioner too in Nebraska, and I think this is important for folks to understand who aren't as familiar with the system, is that court costs are not static. And what I mean by that is court costs are itemized on each case based on actions that are taken throughout the court case. So in each court case, you have this sort of baseline set of things that have to happen, right? You're paying for the judge, paying for the courtroom, prosecution. So if I get a case and that person pleads the next day, the court costs are about $49, which may not sound like a lot to a lot of people, but $49 is a significant amount of money for people who aren't making a lot of money. That cost then starts to increase with the amount of actions that are taken in that case. So the reason I think that's important to note is the very notion of exercising your rights demanding a trial, having a preliminary hearing, doing depositions. Anything that requires a subpoena to be sent out to an individual by the sheriffs, whatever it may be, things that you are entitled to do, adds a cost. And so the further that you take a case down the road, and the more that you choose to exercise your rights, court costs increase. I'm not necessarily saying off the top of my head that that's necessarily wrong. There's, I think, an administrative cost that comes along with a lot of these things. But as we're talking about the human aspect of this, I think it's really important to understand the interplay of the exercising of one's constitutional rights with their ability to pay, and what kind of chilling effect that may or may not have on an individual choosing to fully exercise their rights as they work their way through the system. So I think it's really important to link together the practical logistical aspect with that human aspect and what the outcomes actually could be. The next question I wanted to ask is, and again, this is for everybody here, how and why do these types of fines and fees disproportionately affect lower income residents and BIPOC residents of Nebraska and other states? And what does this look like in Nebraska, and how similar is that to the experience of Kansas?
I can start with this one. I think for us, when we are talking about fines and fees and understanding how systems run, we absolutely address the institutional racism and patriarchy that we see in the systems. And I know for some folks, that's like a third rail issue. It's hard to say, but institutional racism does exist in Nebraska. And people need to understand that. So my experience as a Black woman navigating these systems is absolutely going to be different than my white counterpart. And so when we talk about the impacts of the BIPOC communities, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, the acronym. I'm specifically in Douglas County and Omaha, the most populated county in the state. And so I live specifically in North Omaha, which is a set geography, like I think that's east of 72nd, north of like Dodge Street, right? So it's a pretty big geography, but that's ideally where most folks of color are residing. And you see the over policing in community. So there are more police officers in our community for lots of reasons that we can talk about as we keep going. So that means I'm more apt to having touches with law enforcement. As we think about the education system and seeing school resource officers in our schools, that did not just provide safety if there, for example, was an active shooter, which was the idea behind having school resource officers inside of our education systems. It actually criminalizes the student. So now if a student is acting out, they are removed from that classroom. They can now get a ticket for disturbing the peace, which starts to what Desmond named of that school to prison pipeline, right? So what are those fees when they're on probation, so on and so forth, right? Like you see the ripples. And so if we don't name that within our systems and in specific communities that we are targeted in a specific way because of our social systems surrounding us, then we're never going to get upstream to then really answer, well, how do all Nebraskans exercise our constitutional rights to navigate this? Then how do we also really answer the larger question of like, how does Nebraska run? And in my opinion, it's not on the backs of our community members or folks that are navigating intersecting systems of oppression.
When I think about just the relationship between Kansas and Nebraska, they're very similar. And I just got a question. How sustainable is it to collect fines and fees in order to sustain a budget? Is that something as leaders that we want to trust in, that, people will continue to make mistakes and, that we'll continue to tax them on the mistakes that they make? When I was 17, growing up in my community, it was cool. You want to get the nice car, you want to put some rims on there, you want to get the music in there. And those are just, we think about just young people and the things that they see on a day-to-day basis. We have to put ourselves in their shoes. How are they thinking? What images are they seeing? What knowledge are they receiving? And at that time, receiving all the wrong information. Not a lot of resources in order to expand upon my leadership, in order to show me a world that was outside of the community that I was living in. So I'm 17, I have this car. I got pulled over 3 times in a 2-week span. I didn't have insurance. First time it was $1,000. Second, well, I didn't know what these fees were until months after when I had to go to court, right? So in retrospect, the first one was $1,000. The second one was $1,500. The third one was $2,000. So at 18 years old, I had $5,000 in debt in order to drive legally. Now, I had a trajectory, go to school, go to work, feed family, feed myself. But now I'm wrong if I drive. I'm going to get pulled over and go to jail because driving on suspended. I believe that these are the practical ways that fines and fees holds back the average person that's can have all the great intentions in the world. Such as you see, I've been thinking this way for a long time. However, simple things as fines and fees held me back for a long time. Recycling myself in and out of prison, in and out of a system that had I had that investment, that $5,000 that I spoke to in the beginning, what would it look like for that money to be invested in youth, specifically with intention? As leaders, as people, decision makers in this room, I just want to stretch everybody's mind and everybody's creativity. What does it look like to stop assessing fees and take some of that money and reinvest in those that need it the best? And I just want to remind everybody that those closest to the problem are going to be closest to the solutions. So as we think about the problems that we face in our communities, you have to have those that are directly impacted by those problems sitting at those tables authentically and organically, and not just having them there just because, but actually giving them a voice at that table. If we truly want to solve some of the problems that we see in our communities, we have to have everybody's voice in those conversations.
Wow, I almost don't need to say anything. No, I thank Ashley and Desmond for that. As I look and we're drawing like the similarities between Kansas and Nebraska, and then expounding upon that, as Ashley talked about systemic racism, and I truly appreciate Desmond saying those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, because we can think we know, but we actually don't know. So centering those people who have been directly impacted gives us an insight into how do we change it from the perspective of how it's impacting their daily lives. So when we look at how and why do these fines and fees disproportionately affect our communities in Nebraska, you got to go back. I know for Douglas County and Omaha specifically, it's with the redlining. It's been designed on purpose, and how people have been generationally trapped in these areas based off of policies that were put in place, whether it was law, whether it was ordinance, whether it was banker policy. These things were put in place, and that's what has trapped people generationally. And so with that, there's also this thing with over policing based off of the broken windows theory. If there are broken windows, that means crime is there, so we need to police that. So this is something that we see, as Ashley mentioned, the constant rolling through of police in those communities. It's not that people in those communities commit more crime, it's just that there are more eyes there. So this is when you start seeing more and more people being ticketed for driving their car. Maybe you were pulled over because the tail light was broken. They didn't know you didn't have insurance at first. So why are we, we have to take a step back and look at it from the standpoint of why are so many people being pulled over? I remember when one of my first panels in Omaha, I did, the police chief was on the panel, and he was talking about the number of people who were pulled over in demographics. And as we talk about, African Americans make up, what are we at, 9% in Omaha now? And they represented more than 30% of the pullover stops. So for me, we have to look at it from that standpoint, why? And that's how we can start looking at all the fines and fees that are on there. Because then you do start, I had that broken tail light. Now I got that fine. Now I had the court fee on top of that because I didn't know my tail light was broken, so I'm going to go fight it because I got my due process and everything that I'm supposed to be able to do. then if I don't pay that fine or fee, then it can trickle down to where I don't have my license, which then I can't go to work. So it's just, again, the trickle down effect of how it all continues to do. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about the rural populations and how things are also impacting rural Nebraska, because crime isn't just to the east of the state. Crime is committed all across the state. At Rise, if you don't know, we work with people who are currently incarcerated and who come home from incarceration. And so we have people who go back to their communities that they came from. So we have people who are going to Dawson County. We have people who are going back out to McCook, Nebraska. And we're seeing the struggle that they have because they also have to pay those fines and fees for probation costs or parole costs, whatever that looks like, the GPSing. And if they can't get a job in rural Nebraska, they're then stuck again with how do I pay for the fines and fees? So it's not that it's just a problem here on the east side of the state. It's how do we ensure that we are working statewide so that our governments aren't depending on these fines and fees to keep running? How are we helping people get out of those systems? Because when I look at it, the number of people that we see struggling with mental health and substance use disorders isn't by way of just happenstance. There's something actually going on, and it's a epidemic, and we need to really start solving for those things too, because those will be the people who we continue to see struggling, not being able to pay the fines and fees, who will keep coming in and out of the systems. And how can we then take our government systems from that dependence on there being their ability to pay or not to pay? Because what also happens is if they have a fine or fee that they haven't paid and they're picked up, all they go do is sit in jail for however many days it takes to pay that off. Then where does that money come from? It comes from the taxpayers, because our correctional facilities receive money from the state, which is our tax dollars. And those numbers keep growing and growing and growing. So how are we going to be able to support a correctional system in the state of Nebraska, cutting property taxes, cutting income taxes, and not being able to ensure those services are taken care of? Do we then therefore depend on the people who barely make $18,000 a year, if that? That's not sustainable.
Yeah, amazing points all around. Two things I'd like to add just briefly, again, from sort of a practitioner's perspective, and I think you all hit this nail on the head a little bit, is what is the cost of trying to obtain these fines and fees? And does that ultimately, in a world where we're trying to look at revenue and balance our books, does it actually ultimately help us? For example, when you have a client who is sentenced to, let's say, 7 days in jail for, a theft or something like that, and they can't pay the costs, they're allowed to, quote unquote, sit out the costs. And that's a thing that judges say just across the board. And what that means is that in addition to their sentence, they are allowed to sit in jail, like what Jasmine just said, in order to pay back the costs instead of paying it out of pocket. I don't know off the top of my head the exact calculation, but 1 day in jail is equal in the court's eyes, I believe, to $115 worth of cost. And so if your court costs are let's say the $70 that you ultimately had for the $49 baseline plus the 2 subpoenas you sent out, that's 1 extra day you're spending in jail. And that 1 extra day you're spending in jail probably costs the taxpayers far more than the costs actually were out of pocket. Again, I'm not saying that administrative fees are the biggest problem, but at the end of the day, that is an issue if we're looking at what is actually both fair and equitable, but is also economically viable for our state. The other thing I'll touch on really quick, which I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but to the question of how this impacts specifically lower income residents. You have to look at the connection or the interplay between the bond that somebody posts to get out of jail and then how that can ultimately be applied to the court costs in the case. And what I mean by that is, let's pretend you're in custody and you ultimately post $100. So let's say $1,000. You post $1,000 to get out of jail. Now, 100 is probably more accurate. $100 to get out of jail, right? You bond out, you post $100. At the end of the day, you work out some sort of plea agreement, or the prosecutor says, you know what, we agree to dismiss this case, but we're going to dismiss it at your cost, which means you then have to pay those court costs. They take that out of your bond money. So let's pretend you're getting out of jail and you don't have any money to your name and you only have the $100 in your pocket. The court, by law, has to apply that bond money first to any court costs that are in the case, and then they give you whatever's left back. So if that $100 is all that you had, and all of a sudden there's about $60 or $70 worth of costs that are taken out of that, you could have a case that's dismissed and have no criminal record, but you have $30 in your pocket instead of the 100 you started out with. And again, for certain individuals, that $100 may be the difference between whether or not they can afford a room for the next couple of days in order to figure out their life as they get out of custody. I think it's a really, really good point that the individuals who are closest to this problem are going to be the solution, because I would venture a guess that very few of us in this room know what it's like to actually get out of jail and not have a place to stay, a job, or a support network. And the difference between $100 and $30 because of that court cost that got taken out can really make or break somebody's existence as they get out of custody. So I just say that to sort of send home the human aspect, because I think that's really, really helpful as well.
Can I add something really quick?
Absolutely,
Jagger?
yes.
I think for me, the question in front of us, like, so say all of our fines and fees did flow our government in a way we're like, yes, it's making budget. Like, is that the Nebraska that we actually want? Right? Like, do we want a Nebraska for our neighbors, our friends, our family, that we are criminalizing people more, that we are pushing on maybe the worst mistake that they've ever made to fund the way in which our state works? Like, to me, that's like the fundamental theoretical question that we want to ask ourselves about the Nebraska that we want to create and that we want to live in.
A very good point. And I know we're getting close on time. I'm getting the nods from the front table here. So I want to ask this I know I want to leave enough time for a Q&A, at least briefly. So I want to ask this last question because I think it cuts down to the quick of the point, but we'll try to make it as succinct as possible. Do you have any ideas or thoughts regarding the correlation between tax rates and local government reliance on fines and fees? How can cities and states avoid over-reliance on fines and fees as a revenue source? It's a very simple question to answer in like 5 minutes. So how do we fix it?
So I'll be real quick. About 10 years, Brownback sent out a series of tax cuts, and my opinion of that is it was a failure. It wasn't the best decision, but I wasn't governor, right? But I just think about that money and how it was mismanaged. Just through my research, there were about $4 billion that was just left on the table because the government wasn't able to do what they said they were going to do. Some of the jobs they said they were going to make, it just didn't happen. They didn't have the time. So about $4 billion was just left on the table. But I think about that number because there's also $40 million that's left on the table as it pertains to justice reform. And in Wichita, Sedgwick County, they spend 49% of the city's budget on public safety. I believe that assessing fines and fees is a direct opposite of what they were planning to do, because if you're itemizing all of this money in order to collect fines and fees, is disproportionate. As the panel has already said, when you're specifically targeting specific demographic specific areas of the community with higher crime rates, that directly correlates to higher poverty rates. So as I say, just thinking about how much money is invested in public safety, what would it look like to take a more preventative measure in that, and not so much of let's make sure that there's a place to put them after, but where can we put them in our hearts before?
I think the only thing, I totally agree with all of that. So like +1s across the board, Desmond. I think the only thing that I would add, so I'm also the board chair for ACLU Nebraska, and they actually have a smart justice toolkit that looks at what does reform look like for sentencing, fines and fees. And so if folks are wanting like tangible ways and ripples and like dotted lines and action plans, I would really encourage everyone to visit the ACLU Nebraska website, look at the smart justice plan, talk to the staff. They are super open, like they're willing to work, and we're a statewide agency. So we're really willing to work with different geographies and understanding the demographics there to create a space that, right, like that humanizes folks and understanding that we still need to be operational.
I think I'll end with how we started and how Rebecca talked about criminal justice and taxes being so intertwined. We're in the rotunda where we're understanding the problems that you all as senators and leadership are facing. So coming to talk to us and finding out how those are actually intertwined, I think actually opens the eyes to what solutions are there, and being able to actually, when we're debating these things, give concrete evidence to what the policies need to be as we're moving forward. It's not just taking it into consideration from the standpoint of this is what's going to impact just my constituents, but all of Nebraska are the constituents, and we have to realize how those things impact everyone across the state, because severe cuts in funding from the state erodes the local tax base. So what we have to do is then start looking at how are we going to ensure there are more people who are going to thrive versus be crushed by what we're doing for a subset of folks.
So I wanted to leave a couple minutes here for Q&A. I gave my mic to Joey, so there is a microphone. If anybody wants to grab that, just raise your hand. I think we have time for maybe like 1 or 2 questions, maybe a little bit more depending on brevity. I'm bad at brevity.
Can you talk a little bit about decriminalization from the beginning so that some of these things do not even become a criminal offense to begin with? Because you can see the cascading effect of no insurance, which that's not what you intended to have happen to you, but the cascading effect of that and the criminalization of the fact that you didn't have it to begin with, which just started the whole process.
I think information is so valuable. Making sure that we are equipping our young people with information that can change their lives, even opportunities like this, if we start young. That's important. As I look around, I don't see too many young people in this room, but I know for a fact, this is inspirational, even for me. But I just think about just innovative programming at Destination Innovation, which Progeny is a program of that. We focus on 3 aspects. One of our programs is camp, and we focus on entrepreneurship. Root to Power focuses on civic engagement, and Progeny focuses on youth justice reform. And those 3 aspects were chosen because these are the 3 points that impact marginalized communities the most. And I believe that being able to invest more in our young people, or just, our people in general, in order to create our future leaders. And we have to think about, these are the future of our, of our generation. These are the future of what's going to be moving forward. And are we equipping those people with the tools in order to decriminalize themselves? Oftentimes we are put into a situation to where it's just unfortunate, but why do we have to be resilient in order to create the success for our lives? I've had to see a lot of darkness in order to see the light. And I just think about, what if I would have seen that light when I was a young person, how my life would have been different, or how I could have received what I consider success earlier in life. So just more information in the beginning.
Can I add to that, Senator? Is that how Q&A works? So first things first, Desmond, I'm a hot young thing. So I don't know about anybody else in this room, but we're going to have to correct Desmond coming from Kansas, talking about us being old. Like that's what got us claps, not nothing else. And then to your question, so an example that I like to use, in Nebraska, we give weed tickets. So folks with marijuana get tickets. You see the fines and fees assessed, how that ripples. Well, there's a movement now around medical marijuana, monetizing growing of medical marijuana. Once you kind of get into the road of medical marijuana, it then goes into recreational use. And so you think that could, one, if we had that, be a revenue source that could take up from fines and fees, but also folks that look like me have been put in prison because they can't pay the fines for their weed tickets, their marijuana tickets. Now that it's a billion-dollar industry that's been monetized by folks that have used it as an oppressive system, right? And so I think to your point around decriminalization, when you talk about marijuana and the movement around that, that's a really great example. And even for our leaders here that are looking at that, to build that decriminalization in the process up front, not wait for it to come after it passes. What could that movement mean for revenue coming in? And how do we make sure then folks can actualize and create businesses out of this billion-dollar industry, which they got tickets for previously, right?
Add to decriminalizing poverty, decriminalizing homelessness. In Omaha, there's the ordinance where if you're on the median, you can be arrested if, they're willing to do that. We're also talking about decriminalizing mental health. People who are in states where they're suffering from a mental health condition are not necessarily trying to commit a crime. They just don't know. So if we can stop criminalizing people going through health issues and get them the help they need, this can also reduce that as well.
I saw time for one more question. Okay. Any other questions from the audience?
I just would like to hear a little bit about your vision. So if these fines and fees were to go away and the overall size and scale of the criminal justice system and the law enforcement system were to reduce, where could those resources be redirected? What positive impacts could you see? I mean, you've talked a little bit about mental health and substance abuse treatment and different ways to deal with these issues. I'd just love to hear a little bit about your vision.
Yeah, you're pulling on my actual background of public health. So we had this criminal justice bill that we have been working on, LB 50. It was part of the reinvestment initiative of how can we divert dollars from incarcerating people into helping people. There are so many things we can do on the front end and prevention and preventing people from even going into those systems. I think with the passing of the Omaha Economic Recovery Act and those dollars that are actually going to go into businesses and infrastructure is going to go a long way when it comes to our communities, being able to actually have investments in them. When we invest in people, people thrive. And I think that's what we've been missing. So all the money that we're using to incarcerate people, when we're incarcerating people for small amounts of controlled substances versus getting them into treatment, that's money that could have been saved and diverted and put back into the community, that could have been put into education, that could have been put into early childhood education, as Desmond mentioned, starting early. I think there's a lot of things that we can do with the money. And I don't know how many of you know, I think it costs almost $50,000. It's probably a little more now as we're building our way to incarcerate one person per year in the state of Nebraska. There are over 5,000 people that are incarcerated right now in our state correctional facilities. I don't do mental math, but you all can figure that out. It's a lot of money that can be diverted if we just invest in people on the front end and actually get them housing, get them workforce development, things like that. That you teach a person to fish and they can feed themselves and their families for life versus just giving them something. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to start investing in prevention and how we can help people on the front end versus once they're incarcerated and telling them we're rehabilitating them and we're not. And I'll leave it there.
I would agree. IB Black Girl is a reproductive justice organization. So we're thinking about the reproductive well-being and life course of Black women, femmes, and girls. So for us, like as an institution, we would really love to see that investment in education and like maternal health, reproductive well-being initiatives that is provided by the city. So like if I'm thriving as that parent that is choosing to parent and have that pregnancy, then I can now ripple into my kids. What do I need to order to raise those kids in an environment and that I choose that has the resources that I need? And so I think there's absolutely a way to look at our budgets and redistribution of based on your community, what are the people closest to the issue or the opportunity wanting, and then how do we create that environment for them to live in?
I agree with everything said. Just the investment in the preventative measure. In Kansas, we have a program called Word to Life where we use spoken word and music as an outlet for mental health. We go into the schools and are able to identify some of the troubled youth or those that are borderline or may not graduate. And these are the kind of innovative programming that we have to invest more in. There are $40 million in Kansas that sits in a budget. However, a lot of grassroots organizations can access this money because they're not evidence-based. So I would encourage Nebraska to think about how that money is being redistributed into the organizations that are actually doing the work. A lot of times organizations will reach out to those organizations that are in the on the ground in order to get the data. But I believe that if we can invest intentionally in those organizations that are actually doing the work and making sure that the young people or just those getting out of incarceration are fully supported, because recidivism numbers are at a rise, at least in Kansas, because there aren't enough programs available for those that are getting out looking to create change. But if you get out and you don't have the proper resources, you're going to go back to what you know. And 9 times out of 10, that's going to land them right back where they started from. So just being able to, like I said earlier, provide some of those resources and information to those that need it the most.
Thank you all very much. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Right. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our moderator for a profound conversation about how fines and fees fit within our overall revenue system. We will be taking a break now and we'll be coming back at 11:45 for our final panel conversations. Thank you.